Sarah Mitchell wiped the grease from her hands as she stepped back from the small Cessna 172. The engine hummed perfectly now, but she knew tomorrow's newspapers wouldn't mention her mechanical skills. They would focus on her age, her gender, and the fact that she learned to fly at a tiny airstrip outside Millfield, rather than at some prestigious aviation academy. At 24, Sarah had already logged over 800 flight hours, more than many pilots twice her age. She had earned her private pilot license at 17, her commercial license at 20, and her instructor rating just last year, but none of that seemed to matter to the aviation establishment. When she submitted her cross-country speed record application last month, flying solo from Seattle to Miami in under 12 hours, the response had been dismissive at best. "Amateur pilot claims unofficial record," read the headline in Aviation Weekly. The article barely mentioned her flight time, instead focusing on her unconventional background and the fact that she worked part-time as a mechanic to fund her flying passion. The Federal Aviation Administration had acknowledged her flight logs but refused to recognize it as an official record, citing technicalities about witness requirements and timing equipment. Sarah's mentor, Captain Robert Hayes, a retired airline pilot, had warned her this would happen. "They don't take kindly to outsiders," he had told her over coffee at the airstrip diner. "Especially young women who learn to fly on crop dusters instead of in flight simulators." But Sarah had proven herself time and again. She could land a plane in crosswinds that grounded more experienced pilots. She could navigate by instruments alone through weather that sent others running for cover. The morning sun cast long shadows across the runway as Sarah performed her pre-flight inspection. Today was supposed to be routine, a charter flight carrying medical supplies to a remote clinic in northern Montana. The pay was modest, but it kept her flying and helped people who needed it most. She had built her reputation on these unglamorous flights, delivering everything from medicine to emergency parts to places where roads couldn't reach. As she checked the control surfaces and tested the radio, Sarah reflected on the phone call she'd received the night before. Her mother had read the Aviation Weekly article and called to ask if maybe it was time to consider something more stable. The words stung because part of Sarah wondered if her critics were right. Maybe she was fooling herself, trying to break into a world that would never fully accept her. The charter company dispatcher, Mike Rodriguez, approached with the flight paperwork. "Weather's looking rough up north," he said, handing her the clipboard. "Storm system moving in faster than predicted. You sure you want to take this one?" Sarah studied the meteorological data. The conditions were challenging but well within her capabilities. She had flown through worse and knew the mountain routes better than most pilots who had been flying for decades. "I'll monitor it closely," she replied, signing the manifest. "If it gets too rough, I'll turn around." Mike nodded, though his expression showed concern. He had worked with Sarah for 2 years and trusted her judgment, but he also knew the mountains could be unforgiving, especially for pilots flying alone. As Sarah climbed into the cockpit and began her startup checklist, she pushed aside thoughts of records and recognition. Today was about getting vital medical supplies to people who needed them. Everything else was noise. The engine fired smoothly, and she radioed the tower for taxi clearance. In a few minutes, she would be airborne, doing what she loved most in the world, flying. The Cessna lifted off smoothly into the morning sky, climbing steadily toward the mountains. Sarah had no idea that within hours, her flying skills would be tested in ways no training could prepare her for, and that the same aviation community that had dismissed her record would soon be calling her a hero. For now, she simply focused on the horizon ahead and the steady rhythm of the engine carrying her north. 3 hours into the flight, Sarah noticed the weather deteriorating faster than the forecast had predicted. Dark clouds were building over the mountain peaks ahead, and her radio crackled with static from the electrical activity in the storm. She reduced altitude slightly and adjusted her course to avoid the worst of the turbulence. But the storm system seemed to be expanding in all directions. Her destination, Pine Ridge Medical Clinic, was still 40 minutes away when the first emergency call came through on the aviation emergency frequency. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Summit Air Flight 847. We have engine failure and are attempting emergency landing." Sarah's blood ran cold. She immediately switched to the emergency frequency and listened as the pilot, clearly struggling to maintain control, reported his position. Flight 847 was a small commercial aircraft carrying 12 passengers from Billings to Seattle. The pilot reported they had lost their primary engine and were losing altitude rapidly. Their position put them somewhere in the Glacier National Park wilderness area, miles from any airport or suitable landing site. Sarah quickly calculated distances and realized she was probably the closest aircraft to their location. Summit Air 847. This is November 9-47 Alpha Bravo, Sarah transmitted. I'm approximately 15 miles southeast of your position. What's your current altitude and heading? The response came back strained and filled with static. They were down to 8,000 feet and dropping fast. The pilot was trying to reach Kalispell Regional Airport, but Sarah knew immediately they wouldn't make it. Without hesitation, Sarah banked hard left toward the emergency aircraft's last known position. She pushed her engine to maximum power and climbed to get better radio reception. As she flew toward the mountains, she contacted air traffic control to report the emergency and her intention to assist. The controller's voice was tense as he acknowledged her transmission and began coordinating with search and rescue teams. The terrain below was unforgiving. Dense forest broken only by steep valleys and rocky peaks. Sarah knew this area well from her years of flying supply runs to remote locations. There were a few clearings that might work for an emergency landing, but finding them in deteriorating weather would be nearly impossible for a pilot unfamiliar with the region. She had to locate Flight 847 quickly. Pushing through a band of thick clouds, Sarah spotted something that made her heart race. Below and slightly ahead, she could see an aircraft in distress. Flight 847 was struggling to maintain level flight, black smoke trailing from its port engine. The commercial aircraft was much larger than her Cessna, carrying passengers who were undoubtedly terrified as their plane fought to stay airborne. Sarah immediately established radio contact with the distressed pilot. Summit Air 847, I have visual contact with your aircraft. I know this area well and can guide you to emergency landing sites. The relief in the pilot's voice was evident as he responded. Thank God. We're losing altitude fast and need options immediately. Scanning the terrain below, Sarah remembered an abandoned logging strip about 8 miles northeast of their position. It hadn't been maintained in years and would be challenging even for an experienced pilot. But it was their best option. The strip was carved into a valley between two ridgelines, with trees at both ends that had grown back since the logging operation shut down. Follow my lead, Sarah transmitted, banking toward the logging strip. I'm taking you to an old logging road that might work. It's rough and short, but it's your best chance. She reduced power and began a descent, flying slightly ahead and to the side of the larger aircraft so the pilot could follow her path. Behind them, the storm was catching up fast, bringing heavy rain and dangerous downdrafts. As they approached the valley, Sarah could see the abandoned strip below. It looked even worse than she remembered, partially overgrown and with standing water in several places. But there was no time to find alternatives. Flight 847 was losing altitude rapidly, and the passengers' lives depended on getting the aircraft on the ground safely. The next few minutes would test every skill Sarah had learned in her years of flying, and every instinct she had developed navigating the treacherous mountain terrain. Sarah flew her Cessna in a tight circle around the abandoned logging strip, studying every detail of the terrain below. The runway was shorter than ideal for a commercial aircraft, with tall pine trees at the approach end, and a steep upslope that would help slow the landing, but make the approach treacherous. Rocks and debris scattered across the surface would make the landing even more challenging. Summit Air 847. The strip is about 2,800 feet long with trees at the south end, Sarah radioed. You'll need to come in steep and short. There's an upslope that will help you stop, but watch for debris on the surface. The pilot's response was tight with concentration. His aircraft was now below 4,000 feet and still descending. Time was running out. Sarah positioned herself to demonstrate the approach path. She dropped her flaps and reduced power, showing the distressed aircraft exactly where to aim and how steep the descent needed to be. The wind was picking up as the storm approached, adding dangerous gusts that could push an aircraft off course during the critical landing phase. As Flight 847 lined up for its approach, Sarah could see passengers pressed against the windows, their faces pale with fear. She maintained radio contact with the pilot, calling out wind conditions and obstacles. You're looking good, maintain that glide path. Watch for wind shear in the valley. There's a crosswind from the west. The commercial aircraft came in fast and steep, its damaged engine trailing smoke. Sarah held her breath as she watched the plane clear the trees by mere feet. The pilot fought to keep the aircraft straight as it touched down hard on the rough surface. Immediately, Sarah could see debris flying from the landing gear as the plane bounced and struggled to maintain direction. "You're down." "You're down!" Sarah called out as Flight 847 rolled to a stop just before the upslope at the end of the strip. But her relief was short-lived. Smoke was now pouring from both engines, and she could see people beginning to evacuate through the emergency exits. The aircraft was in danger of catching fire, and they were miles from any rescue services. Without hesitation, Sarah began her own approach to the logging strip. Landing her small aircraft on the rough surface would be risky, but the passengers of Flight 847 needed immediate help. She touched down smoothly and taxied toward the disabled commercial aircraft, positioning her plane to act as a windbreak and emergency beacon for rescue services. As Sarah shut down her engine and grabbed her emergency medical kit, she could hear children crying among the passengers who were now standing in a group near the aircraft. The pilot of Flight 847, Captain James Morrison, was moving among his passengers, checking for injuries. His co-pilot was examining the aircraft's exterior, looking worried about the smoke still coming from the engines. "Is everyone okay?" Sarah called out as she approached the group. Captain Morrison looked surprised to see someone so young emerge from the rescue aircraft, but his professionalism took over. "We have 2 passengers with minor injuries and 1 elderly woman having chest pains," he reported. "The aircraft systems are failing and I'm worried about fire." Sarah immediately took charge of the medical situation while Captain Morrison worked to secure his aircraft. She had basic emergency medical training and knew they needed to move the injured passengers away from the damaged plane. The elderly woman, Mrs. Dorothy Chen, was showing signs of cardiac distress brought on by the stress and fear of the emergency landing. The storm was now almost upon them, bringing heavy rain and strong winds. Sarah realized they needed shelter immediately, but they were in the middle of wilderness with no buildings or vehicles in sight. She remembered seeing an old logging camp structure about half a mile north of the strip during her earlier reconnaissance flights. "We need to move everyone to shelter," Sarah told Captain Morrison. "There's an old logging building north of here. It's not much, but it will get us out of the weather until rescue arrives." She used her aircraft's radio to contact search and rescue, providing precise GPS coordinates and a detailed report of the passengers' conditions. As the first raindrops began to fall, Sarah organized the 12 passengers and 2 crew members into a group capable of hiking to the shelter. She distributed emergency supplies from both aircraft and prepared to lead them through the forest to safety, knowing that the real test of survival was just beginning. The storm hit with full force just as Sarah finished organizing the survivors into groups. Heavy rain soaked through their clothes within minutes, and the wind howled through the forest with frightening intensity. Mrs. Chen's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and 2 other passengers, a teenage boy with a sprained ankle and a middle-aged woman with a deep cut on her forehead, needed immediate attention. Sarah made the difficult decision to split the group. "Captain Morrison, take 8 passengers to the logging shelter. Follow that ridgeline north for half a mile. You'll see a clearing with a concrete foundation and partial roof structure." She pointed through the driving rain. "I'll stay with Mrs. Chen and the injured passengers until the weather improves enough for them to travel." Captain Morrison hesitated. He didn't want to leave anyone behind, especially in the hands of someone he'd just met. But Sarah's calm confidence and clear knowledge of the terrain convinced him. "How do we know you'll be able to find us?" he asked, shouting over the wind. Sarah pulled out her handheld GPS and showed him the coordinates she'd already marked. "I'll get them stable and follow as soon as possible. If rescue arrives first, guide them to these coordinates." She handed him her backup emergency radio. "Channel 16 for emergency services. Channel 12 for direct contact with me." As Captain Morrison led the larger group into the forest, Sarah turned her attention to the 3 passengers who couldn't make the hike. Using tarps and emergency blankets from both aircraft, she improvised a shelter against the side of Flight 847's fuselage. The teenage boy David Martinez was conscious but in pain. The injured woman, Linda Foster, had lost a significant amount of blood and was showing signs of shock, but Mrs. Chen was Sarah's primary concern. The elderly woman's breathing was labored and her skin was pale and clammy. Sarah suspected she was having a heart attack brought on by the stress of the emergency. Using her basic medical training, she positioned Mrs. Chen to ease her breathing and monitored her pulse, which was weak and irregular. Stay with me. Mrs. Chen, Sarah said gently, holding the woman's hand. Help is coming. You just need to hold on. She used the aircraft radio to contact emergency services, providing detailed medical information about each patient's condition. The dispatcher confirmed that rescue helicopters were mobilizing, but the storm was grounding all aircraft for at least another hour. Time seemed to move slowly as Sarah worked to keep her patient stable. She used supplies from her medical kit to bandage Linda's head wound and improvised a splint for David's ankle using materials from the aircraft cabin. The teenager was scared but trying to be brave, asking questions about flying to keep his mind off the pain. Have you ever landed on a strip like this before? David asked, wincing as Sarah adjusted his splint. Sarah smiled despite the circumstances. Nothing quite this rough, but I've landed on some pretty challenging places. Old mining roads, dried lake beds, even a highway once during an emergency. The rain continued to pour down, and Sarah could hear trees creaking ominously in the wind. She periodically checked the radio for updates from Captain Morrison's group and rescue services. The logging shelter group had reached their destination safely, but Mrs. Chen's condition was becoming critical. Her breathing was increasingly shallow and she was drifting in and out of consciousness. Sarah faced a terrible decision. She could try to carry Mrs. Chen through the storm to the logging shelter where there was better protection, but the stress of moving her might trigger a complete cardiac arrest. Or she could wait for the weather to improve, but that might be too late. The elderly woman needed advanced medical care immediately. That's when Sarah heard it, the distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm. She grabbed her emergency flare gun and fired 3 bright red flares into the gray sky. Through her radio, she heard the rescue pilot's voice. We have visual on flares. Are you the aircraft emergency at the logging strip? Affirmative, Sarah responded. I have 3 critical patients who need immediate medical attention. 1 elderly female with cardiac distress, 1 with significant head trauma, and 1 with possible fracture. Can you reach us in these conditions? The rescue pilot's voice was professional but concerned. Winds are marginal for landing, but we'll attempt it. Keep those flares coming and clear an area for touchdown. Sarah looked around at the debris-covered logging strip. Landing a helicopter in these conditions would require exceptional skill, but these rescue pilots were among the best in the world. As the helicopter fought through the storm toward their position, Sarah knew that the next few minutes would determine whether her patient survived this ordeal. The rescue helicopter appeared through the storm like a guardian angel, its powerful rotors churning the rain into a chaotic spray. Sarah could see the pilot fighting to maintain control, as dangerous downdrafts from the surrounding mountains buffeted the aircraft. She continued firing flares to mark the landing zone she'd cleared by dragging debris away from a relatively flat section of the logging strip. The helicopter pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Maria Santos, was a veteran with over 15 years of mountain rescue experience. Through the radio, her voice remained calm despite the challenging conditions. Ground team, we're coming in hot. The winds are gusting to 40 knots, so we'll need to work fast once we're down. Sarah watched in admiration as the helicopter descended through the turbulence. The aircraft swayed and bucked in the wind, but Chief Santos managed to bring it down safely on the makeshift landing zone. Before the skids fully settled, 2 paramedics were already jumping out with medical equipment. I'm Sarah Mitchell, pilot of the rescue aircraft, she shouted over the noise of the rotors. The elderly woman is my primary concern. Possible heart attack. The woman with head trauma has lost significant blood, and the teenager has a suspected fractured ankle. Paramedic Jake Chen immediately went to work on Mrs. Chen while his partner, Susan Rodriguez, began treating Linda's head wound. Good work keeping them stable, Jake called out to Sarah. This lady's definitely having cardiac issues, but you buying us time probably saved her life. Within minutes, the medical team had Mrs. Chen stabilized with oxygen and cardiac medication. They quickly loaded her into the helicopter along with Linda, whose bleeding was now under control. David's ankle injury was painful but not life-threatening, so he would wait for the next trip. Can your helicopter reach the logging shelter? Sarah asked Chief Santos. Captain Morrison has 8 more passengers there, including some children. The pilot checked her instruments and fuel gauge. We can make 1 more trip, but then we'll need to refuel. Where exactly is this shelter? Sarah provided the GPS coordinates and offered to guide them there. I know exactly where they are. I can ride along and show you the approach. Chief Santos nodded approvingly. Climb in. We'll get these patients to medical care and then come back for the rest." As the helicopter lifted off with its first load of patients, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and continued anxiety. Mrs. Chen and Linda were now getting the advanced medical care they needed. But 8 people were still stranded in the wilderness, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The flight to the regional medical center took 20 minutes through rough weather. Sarah watched the paramedics work on their patients during the flight, impressed by their skill and professionalism. Mrs. Chen's color was already improving with the oxygen therapy and medication, and Linda had regained consciousness and was asking about the other passengers. At the hospital, Sarah helped transfer the patients to the emergency room staff before the helicopter refueled for the return trip. The emergency room physician, Dr. Amanda Walsh, pulled Sarah aside. "That elderly woman owes you her life. Another hour without treatment and she would have gone into complete cardiac arrest." During the refueling, Chief Santos and her crew studied topographical maps of the logging shelter area. The weather was actually getting worse, with wind speeds increasing and visibility dropping to near zero in some areas. "This next pickup is going to be even more challenging," the pilot admitted. "The shelter is in a narrow valley with limited approach options." Sarah studied the maps with them, pointing out landmarks and potential hazards. "There's a small clearing about 200 yards south of the shelter. It's not ideal, but it might be big enough for a helicopter. The main challenge will be the power lines from the old logging operation. They're still standing in some areas." As they prepared for the return flight, word of the rescue operation was already spreading. News crews were gathering at the hospital, and aviation officials were monitoring the emergency frequencies. The Federal Aviation Administration Dispatch Center had been tracking Sarah's involvement from the beginning, and her precise navigation and calm professionalism under pressure were being noted at the highest levels. The return flight to the mountains would be even more dangerous than the first. But Sarah knew that Captain Morrison and the remaining passengers were counting on them. As the helicopter lifted off into the storm, she realized that this day had already changed her life in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. The final rescue proved to be the most harrowing of all. As Chief Santos fought to keep the helicopter stable in the increasingly violent storm, Sarah guided them through the treacherous mountain valleys toward the logging shelter. Visibility was nearly zero, and dangerous downdrafts threatened to slam the aircraft into the rocky terrain below. "There," Sarah pointed through the rain-streaked windscreen. "I can see the clearing." The small opening in the forest looked impossibly tiny for a helicopter landing, surrounded by tall trees that swayed dangerously in the wind. Chief Santos circled once, studying the approach path and calculating wind vectors. "It's going to be tight," the pilot said grimly. "Those trees don't leave much room for error." She keyed her radio to contact the survivors at the shelter. "Ground team, this is Rescue 1. We're attempting landing at the clearing south of your position. We'll need you to guide us with flashlights or emergency signals." Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the static. "Copy, Rescue 1. We can see your aircraft. We have flashlights marking a path to the clearing. Be advised, we found power lines running along the eastern edge. Very hard to see in these conditions." Sarah felt her heart racing as Chief Santos began the descent. The helicopter dropped through the turbulent air like a controlled crash, the pilot making constant adjustments to compensate for wind gusts. Tree branches whipped against the aircraft's sides as they descended into the narrow clearing. The landing was harder than intended, but they were down safely. Through the storm, Sarah could see Captain Morrison and the remaining survivors running toward the helicopter. The children were crying from fear and cold, but everyone was alive and mobile. The passengers climbed aboard quickly while Sarah and the paramedics helped secure them in the cramped cabin. As Chief Santos lifted off for the final time, Sarah looked back at the abandoned aircraft and makeshift shelters where the drama had played out. Flight 847 sat alone on the logging strip, a testament to Captain Morrison's skill in getting his passengers down alive. Her own small Cessna waited nearby, and she realized she would need to return later to recover it once the weather cleared. The flight back to civilization seemed surreal after the intensity of the rescue operation. The passengers were exhausted but grateful, many of them asking Sarah about her background and how she had known about the emergency landing sites. When they learned she was the same pilot whose speed record had been dismissed in the aviation press, several passengers expressed amazement. "You saved our lives," said Margaret Foster, Linda's sister who had been among the shelter group. "I read that article about your flight record. Those people don't know what they're talking about. David Martinez, despite his injured ankle, was fascinated by Sarah's flying stories and declared his intention to become a pilot himself. At the hospital, all the passengers received medical attention and were reunited with their families who had rushed to the scene. Mrs. Chen, now stable and recovering in the cardiac unit, insisted on meeting with Sarah personally. "You are an angel," the elderly woman said, tears in her eyes. "I will never forget what you did for all of us." But the real impact of the rescue became apparent over the following days. News of Sarah's role in saving 14 lives spread throughout the aviation community and beyond. The same publication that had dismissed her speed record now ran a front-page story titled "Hero Pilot Saves Lives in Mountain Rescue." Aviation professionals, who had previously ignored her accomplishments, were calling to offer opportunities and praise the Federal Aviation Administration, which had refused to recognize her cross-country record, issued an official commendation for her actions during the rescue. Chief Santos recommended her for a Civilian Heroism Award, noting that her local knowledge and flying skills had been essential to the mission's success. More importantly, major airlines and aviation companies began reaching out with job offers. The prejudice and skepticism that had followed her throughout her career evaporated overnight, replaced by recognition of her exceptional abilities and judgment under pressure. 3 months later, Sarah accepted a position as a senior pilot with a prestigious medical transport company, flying critically ill patients to specialized treatment centers. Her first day on the job, she found a newspaper clipping taped to her locker, the original article dismissing her amateur flight record, with amateur crossed out in red ink and hero written above it. Captain Morrison, who had become a close friend and mentor, visited her at the new job. "You know what the difference is between a good pilot and a great pilot?" he asked with a smile. "A great pilot doesn't just master the machine, they master themselves under pressure. That day in the mountains, you showed everyone what real flying looks like." Sarah smiled as she performed her pre-flight inspection on her new aircraft, a state-of-the-art medical transport helicopter. The critics who had once questioned her credentials now sought her expertise. The aviation establishment that had dismissed her achievements now celebrated her as an example of excellence in flying. But for Sarah, the greatest satisfaction came from knowing that 14 people were alive today, because she had refused to let others define her limits. Every flight now carried the weight of that responsibility, and the joy of proving that sometimes, the most important records aren't written in logbooks. They're written in lives saved.